Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some really fascinating stuff today in Book 5 of Plato's Republic. We're going to be looking at what Plato had to say about women and their roles in this ideal society he's been describing.
Yeah, it's really interesting how this comes up
We've already spent all this time building this perfect city.
with the philosopher kings and the guardians and all of that.
Exactly. So you'd think maybe Plato would be ready to move on to, like, I don't know, the legal system or something. But that's where things take a surprising turn.
It's like Socrates is trying to just casually move on to other topics.
Okay, that's settled. What's next?
Yeah, almost as if the role of women is just like a minor detail to figure out later.
Footnote.
But his companions, Glaucon and Adeimantus, they're not letting him get away with that.
They're like, hold on, Socrates. You can't just breeze past this.
Exactly. They're basically saying, you have to explain this. How do women and children fit into this whole guardian class thing? You can't just leave that hanging.
Yeah, it's almost like Socrates knows he's stepping into a hornet's nest here.
Oh, absolutely. Because what he's about to suggest is so radically different from the norms of his time.
Mind-blowing.
Yeah, and the first big challenge he faces is this whole idea, this deeply ingrained belief that men and women are fundamentally different by nature. So obviously they should have different roles in society.
You can almost hear people back then thinking, yeah, of course men and women are different. That's just common sense.
Yeah.
So they can't have the same jobs, can they?
Yeah.
What's he even talking about?
Exactly. But Socrates, he's not one to accept those simple answers.
He loves to dig deeper.
He really picks apart that whole natural differences argument. Like, he acknowledges that men and women have different biological roles, for sure, in terms of reproduction. But then he points out that they also share a lot of really important qualities. Qualities like courage, intelligence, a sense of justice.
The very things you'd need to be a guardian.
Precisely. Those aren't male or female qualities. They're human qualities.
And he uses some really interesting examples to illustrate this point, too. He throws out this question. Is there any task, any job in running a city that a woman is inherently incapable of doing?
And it's such a simple question, but it's brilliant. Because his companions really struggle to come up with a satisfying answer.
It's like he's saying, okay, if women are so fundamentally different, then show me, prove to me that there's something they absolutely cannot do.
And they can't. He even brings up examples like weaving and baking, tasks that were traditionally seen as women's work. But he points out how complex and demanding those tasks actually are. Look, if women can manage all that, why on earth couldn't they also handle governing or defending the city?
It's so clever because it forces the audience, both back then and now, to confront their own biases. It makes us really examine whether these distinctions between men's work and women's work are based on anything real or just on outdated assumptions.
Absolutely. And this all leads up to his big radical proposal.
A bombshell.
Yeah, the bombshell. Socrates proposes that women who have the right aptitude, the right character, they should receive the same education as men. And that includes everything: music, poetry, physical training, and even, get this, military training.
Whoa, hold on. Same education, including like combat training.
That's right.
That must have been absolutely shocking for people to hear back in.
Oh, yeah. We're talking about ancient Greece, where women were generally expected to stay home and manage the household. That was their sphere.
Their domain.
To suggest that they should be training alongside men, preparing for war, that was practically unthinkable.
So radical.
But Plato, he knew how to push boundaries even further. He even suggests that women, just like the men, should train naked.
Okay, and that's definitely grabbing everyone's attention. But is he really saying that nudity is like some essential part of becoming a guardian? That seems a little extreme.
Not really. I think he's using that image of naked training to expose the hypocrisy of social norms. It's like he's asking, why are we so obsessed with these arbitrary rules about what's modest and what's not, when what really matters is developing strength and virtue? Those things have nothing to do with clothing.
It's more about challenging people's comfort zone, getting them to think about what truly matters instead of clinging to outdated notions of modesty.
Exactly. And the key takeaway here is that for Plato, excellence should be the goal, regardless of gender. He's saying, let's focus on what really matters, on developing the best possible human beings.
Okay, so he's pushing for equal opportunities in education. But it doesn't stop there, right? Socrates envisions women actually taking on these roles of guardians,
Yeah.
right? Actively protecting and governing the city.
Absolutely. He's not just saying, oh, women should have the chance to study these things. He's saying they should be out there in the world, shaping and defending their society alongside men.
He wants us to imagine a world where leadership and strength are not defined by whether you are a man or woman, but by your character and your abilities.
That's the vision. And that's what makes Book 5 so groundbreaking.
Pretty bold vision, especially for his time. I'm guessing people had some thoughts on this.
Oh, you bet they did. But we'll have to delve into those reactions a little later. It's not like everyone's, yes, Socrates, you're absolutely right, and everyone's on board.
These are big ideas, even for people who were used to Socrates and his way of thinking.
Exactly. They're intrigued. They're listening. but they don't necessarily agree with everything he says right away.
Which makes sense. They're being presented with something that goes against everything they've been taught about how society works.
Even someone like Glaucon, who's usually pretty open-minded, willing to question traditional views, he still has some reservations.
Of course, you can't just snap your fingers and erase all those years of social conditioning.
Yeah, and Glaucon actually says at one point that some of what Socrates is suggesting might seem absurd to most people in their society. But, and this is important, he's willing to entertain the idea that maybe, just maybe, those norms are wrong.
So it's like even the people who are most open to change still find themselves limited by the expectations of their culture. It's hard to step outside of that.
Absolutely. And that's what I find so fascinating about Socrates. He's constantly pushing people beyond those limitations, forcing them to really confront those deep assumptions and consider completely different ways of seeing the world.
And in this case, he's arguing that what might seem absurd or ridiculous at first glance could actually be the most logical, the most beneficial way to organize a society. Like with the whole naked training thing, right? He points to the Spartans and Cretans to show how something that seems totally outlandish can actually become totally accepted.
He's challenging those preconceived notions. He's essentially saying, let's be guided by reason and experience, not by what's just customary or fashionable or what everyone's used to.
But I have a feeling things are going to get even more complicated when Socrates drops his next bombshell. We haven't even gotten to the wives in common idea yet, right?
Oh, yeah, that's coming up. And that's where things get really controversial.
All right, let's unpack that a little bit. What is Socrates actually suggesting? Because I'm sure that phrase is raising some eyebrows.
He's basically saying that within the guardian class, there shouldn't be traditional family units as we understand them. Instead, all the women would be considered wives in common to all the men, and they wouldn't live together as individual couples.
Okay, whoa. That is definitely a major departure from even the most progressive ideas about family back then.
Yeah.
In ancient Greece, the family was seen as the bedrock of society, right?
Exactly. And that's why this is such a revolutionary proposal. He's challenging one of the most fundamental assumptions of his time, that the private family unit is essential for social stability.
If he's just throwing out this traditional family structure,
Yeah.
what's the reasoning there? What's the end goal?
His biggest concern is unity and harmony. He believes that private families create all these divisions within society. People become more loyal to their own relatives, their own kin, instead of putting the common good first. And he sees that as a huge obstacle to creating a truly just and unified city.
So by removing these private families, he's hoping to create a stronger sense of shared purpose, shared loyalty among the guardians. They would all be one big family.
Precisely. He imagines the guardians as this kind of extended family where everyone is considered a brother or sister, a mother or father. He thinks this would eliminate all the conflicts of interest that inevitably come from private property and family ties.
But how does he think this is going to work in practice? What about jealousy, competition, even chaos? Won't all those things arise if there's no structure of traditional marriage and family?
Those are very valid questions, and to be fair to Plato, he doesn't really provide a ton of specific details on how this whole system would function.
So is he just glossing over those practical challenges? Is this just some utopian fantasy that could never actually exist in the real world?
I think it's more nuanced than that. Plato's being deliberately provocative here. He's using this thought experiment to get people thinking about completely different ways to organize society, to question assumptions that seem so obvious to us that we don't even think about them. But maybe those assumptions are holding us back from creating a more just and harmonious world.
So even if this specific idea of wives in common isn't meant to be taken literally, it's still pushing us to really think critically about the role of family in society. Are there other ways of doing things? Are there better ways? What are the pros and cons?
Exactly. It's all about asking those big questions that are still relevant today. Like, how do we balance individual desires with the needs of the community? How do we build a society that's both fair and stable? And what should the role of family be in that society?
Big questions, no easy answers for sure. But let's not forget the other major element of Socrates' proposal, which is that the guardians wouldn't just share wives, they would also be responsible for raising all the children together. It wouldn't be my child versus your child.
That's right. Socrates envisions a system of communal child rearing. The children would be raised not by their biological parents, but by the entire guardian class as a collective.
So everyone's raising the next generation of guardians together. That seems like it would require an immense amount of trust and cooperation.
Absolutely. And this idea has some really interesting implications for the role of women in this ideal society. They're not just expected to be warriors and rulers, they're also entrusted with shaping the minds and characters of the future leaders. It's a huge responsibility.
Yeah, it's a huge shift from that traditional view of women as primarily focused on domestic duties within their own homes. This is like taking it to a whole other level.
For sure. And while some people might see all of this as totally unrealistic, it really forces us to confront some fundamental questions about gender roles, about social structures, about the nature of a just and fulfilling life, questions that are still so relevant and worth debating today.
Definitely. So given all that, what's the reaction to this bombshell? How do Glaucon and Adeimantus respond to all of this wives in common thing, the communal child rearing, the whole shebang? All right, so last time we left off with Socrates basically proposing this whole radical idea of wives in common and the communal child rearing. What's the reaction? Are Glaucon and Adeimantus like ready to sign up for this whole new way of life?
It's not a simple yes or no answer. It's more like a mix of curiosity and skepticism, I'd say. They're definitely intrigued by this whole idea of a truly unified state, but they also bring up some pretty practical concerns. Like Glaucon, he brings up jealousy. How do you prevent that?
Yeah.
In a system where nobody has an exclusive claim to a spouse or even to their own children, that seems like a recipe for conflict.
Yeah, that tracks. Even today, the idea of completely shared spouses, it would definitely raise some
I
eyebrows,
think it's definitely pushing boundaries, to say the
to
least.
say the least, yeah.
But Socrates, he acknowledges those concerns, and he actually spends a good chunk of Book 5 trying to address them. He outlines this whole system of carefully regulated mating rituals
Oh, interesting.
that are supposed to produce the best possible offspring for the guardian class. Think of it as a lottery system where pairings are determined based on their perceived qualities and what's best for the city as a whole.
So it's not just like a free-for-all love fest.
There's still like a level of control and organization here. It's all very calculated.
Very calculated, very, yeah.
Yeah. And Socrates is very clear that the goal is to create the healthiest, the strongest, and most importantly, the most virtuous citizens, all for the benefit of the city. Personal preferences, romantic attachments, all of that takes a back seat.
So that sounds a bit, I don't know, cold, calculating. Like, where does love fit into all of this?
That's a great question. And it really points to this tension that runs through the entire Republic, really. Plato, he's aiming for this perfectly rational, perfectly ordered society.
Right.
But human emotions, they don't always fit neatly into that framework.
No, they don't. They tend to be a bit messy.
Messy is a good word for it.
And it seems like he recognizes that love, those personal relationships, they can be powerful, but they can also be potentially disruptive to the kind of unity and harmony he's trying to achieve.
He's worried that those attachments can lead to favoritism, corruption, and ultimately to the breakdown of social order.
It's like he's willing to sacrifice some individual freedom, maybe even happiness, all for the sake of the collective good.
I think that's one way to interpret it, yeah. And it raises a question that's still with us today. How do you balance the rights of the individual with the needs of the community? It's an age-old dilemma.
A dilemma, yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's get back to the nuts and bolts of Socrates' proposal here. Like, when these children are born, who's actually raising them in this communal child-rearing system?
He describes essentially a system of nurseries, communal living spaces where the children are cared for by designated nurses, educators, and the biological parents. They don't know which children are their own, and all the children are raised together as equals. They all get the same education, the same opportunities.
So it's not just like shared spouses, it's like a complete redefinition of parenthood, of family as we understand it.
Exactly. And Socrates, he believes the system has certain advantages. For one, it eliminates inequality. It eliminates the potential for favoritism that can arise when children are raised solely by their biological parents. Because in this system, everyone's treated exactly the same, no matter what their family background is.
And it frees up both men and women, really, to focus on their duties as guardians without having to deal with the everyday burdens of childcare.
Absolutely. That's a huge factor. And maybe even most importantly, it's supposed to foster this stronger sense of unity and loyalty amongst the guardians, because these children, they grow up seeing each other as siblings, and they develop this deep commitment to the well-being of the city, of the collective.
It's like the guardian class becomes this one giant family, united by this shared purpose, this dedication to the common good.
But that's the ideal, at least. Of course, Plato doesn't give us like a step-by-step guide on how this would actually work. There are plenty of potential problems that you can imagine. But he does offer this incredibly thought-provoking vision of a society that goes beyond the usual divisions, the usual conflicts that they just seem to plague human communities.
Yeah, it's a vision that it continues to spark debate. It continues to inspire new ideas, even today, centuries after Plato first wrote it down.
It's timeless, in a way.
It is. And it makes me wonder, what does all this mean for us? Like, why should we, the listeners, care about these radical ideas from a philosopher who lived over 2,000 years ago?
For one thing, I think it forces us to examine our own assumptions about gender roles, family structures, what it means to have a just and harmonious society. It challenges us to think critically about the values that we hold dear and how those values shape our institutions, our laws, our whole way of life.
It also, I think, reminds us that there's always room for improvement, that even the things that we take for granted, family, marriage, gender roles, all of that, it can be reimagined, maybe even in ways that could benefit everyone.
I think that's a really important takeaway. And maybe, most importantly, it encourages us to have these open and honest conversations about these complex issues, to consider different perspectives, to really try to work together to create a world that's more just, more equitable, more fulfilling for all.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive into Book 5 of Plato's Republic. It's been a wild ride.
It has.
But I hope everyone listening has enjoyed exploring these ideas with us. It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has.
And remember, the journey doesn't end here. Keep questioning, keep exploring, keep striving to make the world a better place.
Couldn't agree more.